So here's an exercise where in just a couple of verses, you can tell about a hero and how a hero fought and died and why he did it and what were the stakes. Whereas for Achilles, who is the star of the Iliad, it takes 15,000 plus verses to say it. And my teacher, Albert Lord, taught us students that in the medium of oral poetry, you can have expansion, and I think we're all used to that. Look at the Iliad, but you also have compression. And compression itself is not just a feature of oral poetics, in general, Homeric poetry in particular. It's also a thing that the poetic art is very proud of. The more you can compress something and still say the big picture, the better. We'll call the Iliad in general the macro narrative, but these moments of compression where you have a whole story that's squeezed into just a very few syntactical units and metrical units, we'll call that micronarrative. And I would say the relationship of micronarrative with macronarrative is organic in this medium of song culture. And that's why we, as readers of the text today, if we want to try to engage with what's really going on in the system that is reflected in the text, one of the best ways we can write essays and we can read out of the text is to compare the micronarrative and macronarrative. That's always a good way to start thinking about what's going on in any given passage that we're looking at. How does this passage relate to the overall structure, the overall plan, the master plan, the blueprint of, in this case, Iliadic poetry?
You know, you just used the word system. What exactly did you mean by that when you say that about poetry?
Well, because when we say oral poetry, it's not just that you're using the verbal art without the medium of writing or without necessarily having recourse to the medium of writing, but also where you're using a form of language, which is like a language prime, or another way to say it, language squared, language cubed, a specialized language that develops out of everyday language, but then has a special power, but that still has a grammar of its own, it still has its rules. In fact, this grammar, this set of rules is even more complex and more organized than the grammar that we have when we speak everyday language. The idea is that the wording here is very systematic, and that's exactly why I use the word system, just as language is systematic.
And the effectiveness of that system is what makes the micronarrative
so meaningful, so evocative. Once you're hardwiring the system within yourself, and we can even do this as modern readers who don't know the ancient Greek language if we pay attention to keywords and context and all sorts of other cues that we'll be developing as we go on with our project. It's something that we start getting the hang of ourselves. And so in this case, here's somebody who was on the wrong side of the Trojan War, and he leaves a very happy moment in his life. He goes off and fights against the Achaeans, aka the Argives, aka the Danaans, and he dies. And so it's as if you were asking, well, why did he die? What was at stake? And it's mind-boggling that the answer that we're given here in the master narrative is, oh, he died because he wanted to get into the action. He wanted to get into the Kleos of the Achaeans, not the Kleos of the Trojans, the Kleos of the people whom he was fighting. It's as if you're ready to give up your life to get into the medium of your enemy.
And he died for this one line.
And he died for this one line, to be a bit player. So if it's worth dying to get into the Iliad by way of one line, imagine how much more worth it is to get into the Iliad and really be the master narrative, the star of the Iliad, which is the case of Achilles.
Reinforces what's at stake in text A, where he's making that decision.
Exactly. So it's like for Achilles to die is 15,000 times more important. if I can be whimsical about relative degrees of importance. And what we just said about how some lives are more important than other lives, we'll get back to that when we read the Shield of Achilles. So I'm just making a placeholder here for that, but it reminds me of a beautiful line in Civil Action, the movie version, where the voiceover says at the very beginning of the film, "What is the price of a human life?" And we're not going to answer it now, but in a sense, even this exercise in looking at the stakes, where it's just a micro narrative versus the macro narrative, and how it's still a matter of being willing to die in order to get glory. What kind of glory? The glory that is conferred by the medium of Homeric poetry, in this case, the Iliad.